All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're taking on, I think, a really intriguing philosophical question. One that kind of gets at the foundation of how we judge each other, how we judge ourselves. And, it's something I think a lot of people kind of take for granted in everyday life, and that is the whole notion of moral responsibility.
Yeah, and it's one of those, kind of perennial philosophical
Yeah.
puzzles that has real world implications.
Mm.
As you said, it gets to the heart of how we think about, um, you know, blame and praise, punishment, all these things that really matter in our lives.
Yeah, exactly. And so, we've gotten a request from a listener, someone with, I think, a pretty strong philosophical background, someone who really wants to understand, the core arguments for skepticism about moral responsibility.
Right. And I think, for a listener like that, what we really want to do is, cut through some of the noise and really get to the heart of, what the strongest arguments are and how they kind of challenge our typical assumptions about, how we hold people accountable.
Yeah. So, to lay the groundwork here, I mean, what we're talking about specifically is moral responsibility skepticism. And, this is the idea, right? That, humans might just never be morally responsible for their actions, in this fundamental kind of desert sense.
Right. And that desert sense, that's really key in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry we're looking at here. It really emphasizes, drawing on Dirk Pereboom's work that, this is a very specific kind of moral responsibility. It's not just about, whether you should be punished or, whether it's good to hold you accountable. It's really about this deeper notion of whether you fundamentally deserve blame or praise just because you did something, morally right or wrong.
Yeah, it's like that gut feeling, right? That like if you do something wrong, you deserve to be, punished in some way. Or if you do something good, you deserve to be, rewarded. And so it's that kind of like, fundamental intuition about deserts that we're really going to be questioning here.
Exactly. And, I think it's important to distinguish this from other kinds of responsibility. You know, Even if we're skeptical about basic desert, that doesn't mean that we can't still hold people accountable in other ways. We can still say that, certain actions are attributable to them or that they're answerable for their actions or that, they're in charge of certain things. So it's not like we're saying that all notions of responsibility go out the window.
Right. It's really this like, kind of deep foundational layer of, do you, at your core deserve this, kind of reaction or response to your actions? And, I think it's worth noting, before we get into the arguments, that this isn't some, fringe idea. This isn't something that some, obscure philosopher came up with, last week. This is something that, throughout the history of philosophy, you've had really prominent figures, people like Spinoza, Voltaire, Nietzsche, more recently, people like Galen Strawson and Dirk Pereboom, who have all defended this kind of skepticism.
Yeah, it's a view that has a long and distinguished history in philosophy. And I think that speaks to, the fact that it's a serious challenge to our everyday understanding of, morality and how we hold each other accountable.
Yeah. So for you, our, philosophically inclined listener, let's really get into these arguments. And, this AP entry, it really highlights this close connection between skepticism about moral responsibility and the very familiar problem of free will.
Right. I think, for many philosophers, the kind of free will that really matters for moral responsibility, the kind of freedom that, would make you responsible, in this basic desert sense, that kind of freedom is often defined in terms of, the control and the understanding that you need to really deserve blame or praise.
Yeah.
So if it turns out that we don't have that kind of free will, then the foundation for moral responsibility, at least in this desert sense, kind of, collapses.
Right. So let's start with kind of the big, the heavyweight argument, the one that's been around for a long time. And that is the argument from hard determinism. So just to kind of, lay out the basics here. Hard determinism, it's this idea that every event, without exception, including every single human action, is the inevitable result of, prior causes, kind of stretching back in time. And these causes, they all operate according to, these unbreakable laws of nature. So basically, the idea is that everything that happens had to happen given the state of the universe at any given time.
Yeah. And so, the hard determinist argues that if this is true, then the kind of free will that we need for moral responsibility, That kind of genuine ability to have done otherwise or to be the ultimate source of your actions,
Yeah.
that just doesn't exist. And if we don't have that freedom, then it becomes very hard to see how we could deserve blame or praise for our actions.
Yeah. And, the SEP entry, it does point out that, hard determinism, it's not as widely embraced as it maybe once was, especially with, developments in physics like quantum mechanics, which, some people think might introduce some randomness into the universe. But, it's worth noting that determinism hasn't been refuted. It's still a live possibility. And even if, there is some indeterminacy at, the subatomic level, the idea that, our brains and our decision-making processes, that those might still be deterministic, that's something that a lot of people still take very seriously.
Right. And so that kind of leads us to a more nuanced position, maybe a kind of descendant of hard determinism, and that is hard incompatibilism.
Okay. So hard incompatibilism. So this is the idea that, basically, moral responsibility, this basic desert notion of moral responsibility, it's a non-starter, whether or not the universe is ultimately deterministic. So it's kind of taking that skeptical intuition and saying, look, even if there's some randomness in the universe, we're still not responsible. And so, the hard incompatibilists, they're going to challenge, both compatibilism, the idea that you can have free will, and determinism and libertarianism, the idea that, some of our actions are genuinely free in the sense of not being caused by prior events.
Right. And one of the main arguments that hard incompatibilists use against compatibilism is what's known as a manipulation argument.
Mm.
And the SP entry, gives this really nice example from Dirk Perboom. He calls it the four-case argument.
Mhm.
And the basic idea is to try to show that there's no morally relevant difference between, an agent whose actions are causally determined by, events in the natural world and an agent whose actions are brought about by the manipulation of other agents.
Right. So imagine, for example, there's this guy, Plum, and, in one case, he commits a crime and, it's because of his upbringing, his genes, all these deterministic factors that led him to do it. And then in another case, Plum gets, kind of programmed by some neuroscientists, right? They tinker with his brain and they give him the exact same desires and reasoning process that would lead him to commit the same crime. And so the hard incompatibilist is going to say, well, look, intuitively in that second case, Plum's not responsible, right? Because he's being controlled. And then the challenge for the compatibilist is to say, well, why is the first case any different? Why should we think that Plum is responsible in the first case when, ultimately both cases involve these causal chains that are outside of Plum's control?
Right. And, this SEPI entry discusses some of the ways that compatibilists have tried to respond to this.
Mhm.
Some compatibilists, what they call hardline compatibilists, they might just bite the bullet and say, well, yeah, even manipulated agents can be responsible under certain conditions. But other compatibilists, what they call soft-line compatibilists, they're going to try to draw some kind of morally relevant distinction between manipulation and ordinary deterministic causation.
Mhm.
But, as the SEPI entry points out, both of these responses, they face pretty serious challenges. It's hard to see how you can really make that distinction in a way that, preserves our intuitions about moral responsibility.
Yeah. And then, the hard incompatibilist is going to turn their attention to libertarianism, right? The view that, at least some of our actions are genuinely free in the sense of not being causally determined. And here, the main objection is what's sometimes called the luck objection or the disappearing agent objection.
Right. So the basic idea here is that if an action is the result of indeterministic processes, meaning that, given all the events leading up to the action, there were multiple possible outcomes, then which outcome actually occurs seems to be a matter of chance or luck. It's not really something that the agent controls. So if, at that critical moment of decision, the outcome isn't settled by anything within the agent's control, then it becomes hard to see how the agent is really the one who's deciding what happens, rather than just being the locus where these random events occur. And the SIP century points out that this objection applies to both event-causal libertarianism, where the idea is that you have these undetermined events in the brain and those lead to free actions, and also to non-causal libertarianism, where the idea is that free actions aren't caused at all.
Yeah. And what about agent causal libertarianism? So this is the view that, the agent themselves can be a kind of fundamental source of causal power, that they can initiate actions without being caused to do so by prior events.
Right. Well, the ASEPI entry discusses that view as well.
Yeah.
And it points out that hard incompatibilists have a couple of responses to that. First, they might argue that agent causal libertarianism is just incompatible with our best understanding of physics. We don't have any good scientific evidence for these kinds of uncaused causes. And second, they might argue that, even if we granted that agent causation is possible, it's still not clear how that would give us the kind of control that we need for moral responsibility. It's one thing to say that the agent is the cause of their actions, but it's another thing to say that they're in control of their actions in a way that makes them responsible for them.
So, kind of the upshot of all this is that, whether the universe is deterministic or indeterministic, the hard incompatibilist is going to say, look, basic desert moral responsibility just doesn't seem to be possible.
Yeah. And I think, it's important to emphasize that these arguments, they're not just about abstract metaphysics. They have real implications for how we think about things like punishment and forgiveness. People aren't ultimately responsible for their actions, then can we really justify punishing them in the way that we do?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And, it brings us to another really interesting argument, which is Galen Strawson's basic argument. And this one is, it's particularly fascinating because it doesn't actually depend on whether or not determinism is true. It's trying to show that the very idea of being ultimately morally responsible is just incoherent, kind of like a self-contradiction.
Right, and the Seppi entry really highlights that point. It calls it the impossibility of ultimate responsibility. And, I think and Nietzsche had this great line where he talked about the best self-contradiction. And I think that kind of captures the essence of this argument, this idea that, to be truly responsible for your actions, you'd have to be responsible for the way you are, your character, your values, your principles of choice. But to be responsible for the way you are, you would have to have chosen to be that way.
And that's where the problem comes in, right? Because, to have chosen your initial principles of choice, you would needed some prior principles to guide that choice. And then to have chosen those principles, you would needed even earlier principles. And so you get this infinite regress. You can never get back to a point where you were truly the ultimate source of your own being, the cause of yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so the basic argument, is kind of spells this out in a very, clear and systematic way. It says, look, nothing can be the cause of itself. That's just a kind of basic logical principle. But then it says to be ultimately morally responsible, you would have to be the cause of yourself in certain crucial respects. And since that's impossible, ultimate moral responsibility is impossible too.
Right. And the Ceph entry does discuss some of the objections to the basic argument. Some people might say, well, what do you mean by ultimate responsibility? Or is it really necessary to be a causa sui, a cause of yourself to be morally responsible? Maybe there's some other way to ground moral responsibility. But I think the core intuition of the argument, that we can't be responsible for ourselves all the way down, that's a really powerful one.
Yeah, and I think, even if you're not fully convinced by the basic argument, I think it raises some really important questions about, the limits of our control over ourselves.
Yeah, definitely. And that brings us to another argument, which is the argument from Luck. And this one's really interesting because, again, it doesn't really depend on the determinism debate. It says, look, whether the universe is deterministic or indeterministic, luck plays such a huge role in our lives that it undermines moral responsibility. And, the SEP entry, it talks about this in terms of what Neil Levy calls the luck pincer.
Right, and the pincer here refers to two main kinds of luck. First, there's present luck, and that's the luck of the circumstances that we find ourselves in at the time of our actions. And then there's constitutive luck, and that's the luck of our dispositions, our character traits, the kind of person that we are.
Yeah. And so the idea is that, both of these kinds of luck, they can undermine moral responsibility. Present luck, the problem is that, even if you have free will in some libertarian sense, even if you could have done otherwise, the fact that you did what you did might just be a matter of luck. Maybe you were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, or maybe you just happened to have a bad day and that's why you made the choice that you did.
All right. And, the escapation entry gives this helpful example of, what counts as luck. I'd say that, essentially something is lucky if it's significant and we lack direct control over it. And it could easily have been otherwise in relevantly similar circumstances. So, like winning the lottery, that's a good example of luck, right? It's significant, you have no control over it, and it doesn't happen in most other cases. But then there's also what they call non-chancy luck. And that's where, you have a significant trait, but it's not something that you had any control over. So, for example, like someone's IQ, right? That's a significant trait, and it's not something that they chose, but it's not like it's a random event either.
Yeah, that's a good distinction. And so The argument from present luck, it's basically saying that, even if you have libertarian free will, the fact that you made the choice that you did in a particular situation might just be down to luck, you know, factors outside of your control. And then the argument from constitutive luck is saying that, even if you're responsible for your choices in a compatibilist sense, even if your choices are in line with your character, the problem is that you're not responsible for your character. Your character is the product of your genes, your upbringing, all these factors that you didn't choose.
Right. And so the luck pincer is kind of saying that, you're caught between these two kinds of luck. If you emphasize present luck, then libertarianism seems to fall apart. And if you emphasize constitutive luck, then compatibilism seems to fall apart.
Yeah. And the Sapir entry also points out that the luck pincer can even be used to challenge non-historical compatibilist accounts. So, even if you think that moral responsibility doesn't depend on your past, you might still think that it depends on you knowing what you're doing, having some understanding of the moral significance of your actions. But if your ignorance is itself a matter of luck, maybe you were just never taught certain things, or maybe you just happen to forget something important, then that seems to undermine your responsibility as well.
Right. And so, I think the argument from luck, it's a really powerful challenge to moral responsibility. Because it's saying that, even if we grant that we have some degree of free will, there's still this pervasive element of luck that makes it hard to see how we could deserve blame or praise for our actions.
Yeah, it really is a kind of pervasive problem. And then, on top of all this, we have the, kind of the growing body of scientific evidence that seems to challenge our traditional understanding of moral responsibility. And, the SEPP entry talks about this in terms of, findings from neuroscience, cognitive science, social psychology, all these fields that are, kind of giving us a new picture of how our minds work.
Right. And, I think one of the most famous examples of this is the work of Benjamin Libet, who did these experiments where he showed that, there's this brain activity, what he called the readiness potential, that seems to precede our conscious awareness of making a decision.
Yeah.
So, the implication there is that, maybe our conscious will isn't actually causing our actions. Maybe it's just kind of coming along for the ride.
Yeah, those experiments, they really caused a stir, and they're still being debated today. And the SAPI entry, it does point out that there are some methodological and interpretive challenges to Libet's findings. It's not clear that they definitively show that free will is an illusion, but, they've certainly contributed to this, kind of growing sense that maybe our conscious control over our actions isn't as robust as we thought it was.
Right. And then there's this whole other body of research on things like automaticity, situationism, and the adaptive unconscious. And all of this research, it suggests that a lot of our behavior is driven by factors that we're not consciously aware of. Things like implicit biases, environmental cues, all these unconscious processes that are shaping our thoughts and our actions.
Yeah, it's kind of like the iceberg analogy, right? We're only aware of the tip of the iceberg, but there's this whole vast, unconscious realm that's influencing our behavior. And so, some philosophers have talked about this in terms of the threat of shrinking agency. If so much of what we do is driven by these unconscious factors, then does that leave any room for the kind of conscious, deliberate control that we typically associate with moral responsibility?
Right. And, I think this is where the debate gets really interesting because, even some compatibilists are now saying that, maybe the kind of free will that we need for moral responsibility is a lot rarer than we thought it was. Maybe it only kicks in certain very specific circumstances. And so the question then becomes, well, is consciousness even necessary for moral responsibility?
Yeah.
And if so, what kind of role does it have to play?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And then, I think it's worth noting that all of this research is kind of taking place against the backdrop of a more general naturalist perspective, this idea that we're just physical beings, our minds are just our brains. And so, this challenges the traditional notion of soul control, this idea that we have some kind of non-physical self that's in charge of our actions. And, as neuroscience advances, I think this naturalist perspective is only going to become more influential.
Right. And, this FUP entry points out that even though a lot of philosophers have moved away from explicitly dualistic views, the idea that we have a separate soul and body, our everyday intuitions about moral responsibility might still be influenced by a more dualistic picture. And so as we learn more about the brain, we might have to start revising those intuitions.
Yeah. And so, kind of to bring all of this together, We've looked at a lot of different arguments for moral responsibility skepticism. We've talked about the argument from determinism, the argument from hard incompatibilism, the basic argument, the argument from Locke, and the scientific challenges.
Yeah.
And I think, all of these arguments, they raise serious doubts about whether we really are morally responsible for our actions in this basic desert sense.
Yeah. And, for you, our listener who's, really interested in these philosophical questions, I think this raises some really profound challenges. It challenges how we see ourselves, how we see each other, how we think about justice. If we're not morally responsible for our actions, then does that mean that punishment is never justified? Does it mean that we should just give up on holding people accountable?
Yeah, those are, huge questions. And, the case-up entry, it doesn't really give us any easy answers. But it does point to this kind of ongoing debate between what some people call illusionism and disillusionism about moral responsibility. The illusionists, they're going to say that, even if moral responsibility is an illusion, it's a useful illusion. It helps us to live together in society. But the disillusionists, they're going to say that, we need to face up to the fact that moral responsibility is an illusion, and we need to start thinking about how to live in a world without it.
Right. And so yeah, I think this is a really important debate, and it's one that we're going to have to continue to grapple with as we learn more about ourselves and about the world.
Yeah, I think that's a great note to end on. It's a puzzle, it's a challenge, but it's also, a really fascinating and important area of inquiry.
Absolutely. And I think, for our listener who's, clearly interested in these questions, I think, diving into this debate between illusionism and disillusionism,
Yeah.
That's a great next step.
Yeah, definitely. All right, well, that's it for this deep dive. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me.